Senator Gerba.
Merci.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Honourable colleagues, I am speaking from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples. This land acknowledgement is even more important in the context of this bill S-215, an act respecting National Immigration Month. Indeed, it is essential to remember, again and again, the presence since time immemorial of Indigenous peoples on Canada's current territory. It's therefore with great emotion that I rise again before you today to resume the process that began in the previous Parliament with Bill S-286, which died on the order paper. This initiative refers to the journeys taken by many of us here in this illustrious chamber, and by millions of our compatriots who came from all parts of the world to enrich our country with their experience and contribute to our history. Allow me to start with an anecdote, which will help you understand why this bill is so important. A small episode of life that many of you probably experience daily, as long as you're not Caucasian. A few years ago, at a party, my husband engaged in a discussion with a guest at a networking cocktail party that preceded a fundraising gala. Apparently surprised to hear my husband speak excellent French, the woman asked him where he was from. Mischievously, my husband pretended not to understand the meaning of her question and replied that he came from Laval. She said, no, I want to know where you're from. He said, yes, I'm from Laval. We live in Laval. Faced with her perplexed look, who seemed to neither understand nor be satisfied with his answer, he finally revealed his Cameroonian origins. He asked her the same question in turn, and clearly confused, the woman asked him what he meant. What did he mean by that? My husband then gently reminded her that apart from Indigenous peoples, to his knowledge, all Canadians have come from elsewhere. We all come from elsewhere. So, he gently suggested that she ask her parents and grandparents to find out where their ancestors were from. Dear colleagues, you'll have understood that this is a very contemporary scene and remains so today. The scene in this question are quite frequent and quite revealing. They prompted me to formulate a reminder of our shared situation as people from elsewhere, and to do so by means of a bill. Consisting of 3 clauses, the text of this bill is very simple. Its aim is just as simple: to celebrate annually, through a month dedicated to it, the essential role of immigration in building our country. Canada is a country shaped by immigrants. Men and women from elsewhere who, through their hard work, courage, and resilience, helped build the prosperous and inclusive nation that we know today. a country that inspires admiration far beyond its borders to this day. In all fields, whether economics, science, culture, sports, or community life, immigrant women have played an essential role in the great achievements that make us proud as a society. Dear colleagues, one need only look around at the diversity of backgrounds in this very chamber to see the richness of this contribution, or to pay attention to what's happening in each of your regions, to measure on a daily basis the positive and lasting footprint of immigrant communities. Those contributions deserve to be fully recognized, colleagues, celebrated and honored. It is time to do justice to those who, through their commitment, continue to make Canada grow. Before I go into detail about why I propose that Canada have a National Immigration Month, I would like to begin with a clarification. Indeed, it will not have escaped your notice that our migration policy is the subject of many debates witnessed almost daily in the news. Some of these debates are useful, even necessary. Others come dangerously close to theories of rejection and exclusion that have no place in our country. As a proud Quebecer, Canadian and immigrant, I will not hide the fact that I feel challenged and very concerned by the current extremist and populist discourse, which borders on a total rejection of all forms of immigration. Proponents of this hardline dangerously insinuate that immigrants are largely responsible for our country's economic and social problems. It is important to recall that our country was built by successive waves of immigration. It's just a question of time. When did they arrive? Centuries ago? A month ago? A year ago? We all came from elsewhere, whether ourselves or our ancestors. Even today, immigration remains essential for Canada to be able to meet the demographic and economic challenges that lie ahead. An aging population and persistent labor shortages, particularly in several key sectors, make welcoming newcomers more necessary than ever. But welcoming them is not enough. We also must successfully integrate them. That's important. This is why immigration must be thought out, planned, and supported. Successful integration does not rely solely on the efforts of immigrants. It requires a collective commitment from the entire host society. It's up to us to create the conditions that allow newcomers to flourish by facilitating their access to services, language training, and employment, and by providing them with reference points to understand the values and codes of their new living environment, all while respecting their identity and culture of origin. Integration is a process that takes time, but when done properly, becomes a powerful lever for social cohesion, shared prosperity, and the loyalty of future generations. Colleagues, it is imperative to be on the watch for xenophobic and populist policies that seek to divide. Canada must remain an example of tolerance and inclusion. To do so, I beg your pardon. I know my colleague Julie is watching me. She told me several times, don't do that. But I continued to do it because it's important that we can understand how I arrived at today's bill. So, to do so, we must invest to better welcome and retain our newcomers and to ensure their economic prosperity. Similarly, we must invest in the process of selecting immigrants and severely punish those involved in their trafficking. Unfortunately, there are many. Honorable colleagues, immigration is not a burden we must bear. It is our history, our wealth, and our future. Bill S-215 is not intended to call for more or fewer immigrants to Canada or to take sides with any particular element of immigration policy. This project refers to successive generations of immigrants in our country. These generations have developed our country as a multicultural society in the image of the world. These generations are here in this very chamber. They came from all over, and we must celebrate them. Without claiming to be a historian, allow me to briefly review the great waves of migration that have shaped our country. This is just an overview, as I have already addressed this aspect in greater detail at second reading of Bill S-286, the predecessor of this bill, which unfortunately died on the order paper in the previous Parliament. In fact, I invite you to consult that speech if you wish to deepen that historical perspective, which was fairly detailed.
Dear colleagues, it's essential to remember that the territory we now call Canada was inhabited long before the arrival of Europeans. Indigenous peoples lived here for millennia. The Vikings are even believed to have reached the shores of Newfoundland as early as the year 1021. Canada's migratory history is part of a long process that began with the first European settlements, notably the founding of Quebec City in 1608. After the British takeover in 1763, the country successively welcomed American loyalists, then waves of immigrants from Europe, particularly Ireland. At the time of Confederation, 1867, Canada had a population of about 3.6 million. It saw immigration as an essential lever for its development, particularly for colonizing the West. However, these migration policies remained both selective and discriminatory for quite some time, favoring Europeans while systematically excluding Asian, Black, and other populations. This intensive settlement created tensions with indigenous peoples. It led to conflicts, such as the Northwest Resistance in 1885. After the Second World War, Canada became a more open land of welcome. It finally ended discriminatory laws and welcomed refugees displaced by war. The private sponsorship program allowed for the arrival of thousands of refugees from Southeast Asia. By the 1960s, 1/3 of Canadians had origins other than British or French. These waves of migration shaped a multicultural society, making Canada the G7 country with the highest proportion of immigrants. According to Statistics Canada, in 2021, more than 8.3 million people, or nearly 1/4 of the population, were or had been landed immigrants. They were either immigrants, landed immigrants, or permanent residents. With Canada's aging population and a birth rate below replacement level, immigration is now our country's main demographic driver. According to Statistics Canada projections, by 2041, immigrants could represent between 29.1% and 34% of the Canadian population. This underscores the crucial importance of an immigration policy that is thoughtful, inclusive, and forward-looking. Dear colleagues, with this brief look back at the history of our people, I want to remind you of a fundamental truth. As I said at the beginning, with the exception of Indigenous peoples, we all came from somewhere else. Some came centuries ago, decades ago, months ago, or even days ago. We all came from elsewhere to build and populate this country, Canada. However, we must never forget that this process of populating the country and occupying its territory often led to the dispossession of cultures, languages, traditions, and lands of Indigenous peoples. This means our country is both the result of the hopes and dreams of millions of immigrants who came from all over the world to build a better life, and also, unfortunately, for Indigenous peoples, this immigration tragically erased their rights as well as their tangible and intangible assets. These two realities are two sides of the same coin. They are our history, which we cannot deny. They create a demand for justice, reparations, compensation, and a duty of remembrance, which we must share with future generations. Another reason that led to this bill, S-215, was the proliferation in this chamber or in Parliament of motions and laws regarding the celebration of the heritage of this or that community living in Canada. Undeniably, dear colleagues, the purpose of these various initiatives is legitimate. It stems from the same observation as mine. The need to highlight the invaluable contributions of immigrants to our country. I see National Immigration Month as a useful tool for introspection. At a time when some people do not hesitate to blame immigrants for certain complex and difficult social situations. It could serve as a showcase. It could be an opportunity for all of our groups with immigrant origins to highlight the contributions of their communities. By grouping these new celebrations together, this National Month, far from diminishing the existing celebrations, it could be a showcase where we could assemble all communities, celebrate every community, because these communities must be celebrated. No matter their size, they must be celebrated. It would also offer common space to highlight the rich contributions of all immigrants, regardless of the size and importance of their community. I've seen firsthand that the countless groups to whom I've had the opportunity to present this bill do support it. May 15th, 2024, last year, my team and I organized a roundtable. The purpose was to gather the opinions of organizations representing immigrants' interests. We brought together about 30 organizations to learn what they had to say about the initiative I'm leading. During that very productive session, we received input from stakeholders located across the country, representing the largest immigrant communities in Canada. The message we heard was clear. Every stakeholder confirmed their support for a bill to establish a National Immigration Month. Of course, the consultation wasn't exhaustive, but it had the merit of carrying out a serious survey of how these organizations that would be affected would receive this bill. We continued our consultations during the summer of last year, and we did that round over the phone, and it lasted the entire summer. I also asked those I consulted about the month that should be chosen to make the initiative come to life. A certain consensus emerged and settled on the month of November.
En effet, le choix de ce mois s'avère pertinent à plusieurs égards.
This choice is relevant for several reasons. First of all, the month of November already hosts Francophone Immigration Week. Second, the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, which sets out the basic concepts and principles of immigration and refugee protection in Canada, received royal assent on November 1st, 2001. I want to reiterate the foundational nature of this legislation, which provides a historical framework for the key steps of Canada's immigration policy. that's why this legislation is so important for us. For some time, Canadian immigration policy favored white immigration. Explicitly racist laws excluded many candidates. For instance, the tax imposed on the Chinese in 1885, the near-total ban on black immigration in 1911, restrictions on Japanese people, Indian people, and the refusal in 1939 to accept Jewish refugees from the MS St. Louis. 1947 was a turning point. It marked the lifting of some prohibitions. In 1967, with the introduction of a points system based on skill and education and family ties, rather than ethnic origin. The 1976 Act modernized the system, affirmed the principles of diversity and non-discrimination, and recognized refugees as a protected category. As a result, the private sponsorship program, launched in 1979, allowed for more than 327,000 refugees to come to Canada. Since 1980, 5 major immigration pathways structured access to Canada: independent, humanitarian, family, assisted, and economic. Finally, on November 1st, 2001, the Immigration Act of 1976 was replaced by the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act. The new legislation maintains a substantial part of the principles and policies included in its previous iteration, including different categories of immigrants. Furthermore, it expands the category of family to include same-sex couples and common law unions. This legislation is the cornerstone of Canada's current immigration policy. Choosing November to celebrate National Immigration Month was based on powerful symbolism. The passage of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, which came into force on November 1st, 2001. This law is one of the modern pillars of our immigration policy. It allows us to look at this month with a historical and civic point of view. This legislation is one of the pillars, as I said, and we must associate with this pillar Bill S-215. That way, we can make it part of the history of this legislation, which is in force to this day. Also, November is a particularly good time for organizing parliamentary activities. It often coincides with an active period in the House of Commons and the Senate. This facilitates both political and institutional engagement around this commemoration. Aside from Remembrance Day, dear colleagues, November's calendar is relatively clear. That means it can provide the space needed to give full visibility to a national celebration of immigration.
Chers collègues, ce projet,
Dear colleagues, this bill is important to successive generations which shaped this country. The goal is to remind us all that we all came from elsewhere, almost everyone.
Donc, en rassemblant les nouvelles célébrations, chers collègues,
By assembling these new celebrations, dear colleagues, this month will reinforce all the motions we already have here in Parliament that allow us to celebrate our various communities and will highlight who we are as Canadians, Canadians who come from every part of the world.
pardonnez-moi, mes amis.
Pardon me, friends.
Je vais vous raconter une petite vie.
I have a little story for you. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself.
Pour vous dire que je suis arrivée au
I arrived in Canada in 1986 with my husband. We emigrated here by choice for our studies. My husband had received a bursary from the now defunct Canadian International Development Agency so that he could complete his doctorate in communication. However, we had to return to Cameroon after he was done. However, after his studies, we decided to stay in Canada. We chose to stay in Canada because it provided better living conditions for our 4 children, 3 of whom were born here. Today, through various entrepreneurial initiatives from my entire family, because they're all entrepreneurs like me, I can say that we all contribute to this country's prosperity. We created jobs. We welcomed immigrants and foreign workers. I contributed by being here for the last 4 years. However, we always have to answer the same questions. Those that I raised at the beginning of my speech. Where do you come from? Even my children born here, in Northern Montreal and Laval, Saint-Lambert and Lorraine, they're asked the same question. My grandchildren were born here, and they are asked the same question. The goal of this law is to bring forward a change so that we can all understand that we are from somewhere else, so that we don't raise the question anymore. It may be legitimate. People won't stop doing it. However, we need some teachings to underscore it. It needs to be said. It needs to be repeated that, aside from Indigenous peoples, we are all Canadians from elsewhere.
Donc, vous avez pu constater chaque
You'll be able to see then, colleagues, that Canada is fundamentally a land of immigration. Immigration shaped the country that we cherish today.
a month dedicated to immigration will send a powerful message to all Canadians and to international community. So I urge you, dear senators, to be with me and to support this bill. Immigrants are not strangers. They are part of our nation. Immigrants are the past, the present, and the future of Canada. Les immigrants sont le passé.
Immigrants are Canada's past, present, and future. That is why I urge you, honourable senators, to refer Bill S-215, an act respecting National Immigration Month, to committee as soon as possible for study, and that it become law in Canada. Thank you.